Welcome back. The next questions are around when and how should community partners be included as co-authors on scientific papers. So anyone in academia knows that authorship matters, but don't assume that authorship only matters to people in academia. Yes, the concept of publications as currency may not apply. And no, you probably can't pay your community partners in co-authorship because honestly, it's not going to serve the same purpose as it might for a graduate student or a junior faculty member who truly needs publications as a way to keep their job. But that in no way negates the need to include community partners as co-authors on scientific papers. One, it's ethically really important to share credit and intellectual property. And if your community partners have significantly contributed to the research, of course, they should be co-authors. It also can be personally extremely meaningful to community partners to be listed as co-authors on scientific papers. And sometimes I actually feel like they care about it more than I do at this point. It can offer community partners credibility and legitimization that any other work may not be able to do. And if done well, it can help ensure that the papers really truly reflect the entire team's view and has really incorporated community perspectives. They can also strengthen the collaboration. The flip of that is that not offering co-authorship opportunity can cause lots of problems. And I've had several close colleagues who've really burnt some bridges accidentally by not thinking of to include community organizations, community partners on papers because they just didn't even think that they would be interested. So to be a co-author, one must meet co-author criteria. And the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors pretty clearly spells out what it takes to be a co-author. Number one, every co-author must have made substantial contributions to the conception or design of the work or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data for the work. And they need to be drafting the work or revising it critically for important intellectual content, giving final approval, and then agreeing to be accountable for all aspects of the work. Interestingly, the authorship guidelines specifically say all individuals who meet the first criterion, i.e., have been involved in the conception or design of the work or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data, should have the opportunity to participate in the review, drafting, and final approval of the manuscript. That means that if you use the participatory approach, unless it's truly a very, very minor advisory type model, your community partners should have made substantial contributions to the conception or the design of the work or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data. So even the authorship guidelines that have nothing to do with participatory research, these are the guidelines from medical journal editors, really make it clear that we need to be including community partners. For one, avoid gratuitous co-authorship. Just as it's ethically important to include people, it's also ethically important that every co-author actually meets co-authorship criteria. And when they don't, it can actually really have negative consequences. It can be infuriating to partners to have their names added to work that they don't fully agree with, or they don't feel that they really actually own, or they don't want their name even on it. It can devalue community contributions if co-authorship is just sort of seen as gratuitous and any community partner can have their name on a paper and it doesn't mean anything. It's important to create processes that allow community partners to actually meet the authorship criteria. And then make sure that your authorship, the authors and then the text describing your paper match your collaboration model. I can tell you as an editor of a journal, I see many examples of manuscripts where it doesn't. Sometimes where people will have a bunch of community authors on the list of authors, yet the paper is written purely from an academic perspective, talking about community people, members of the team, as if they're just these sort of outside folks that weren't really a part of it. Or conversely, it might be that they talk about this very, intricate, important inclusion process and then don't have any actual community partners on the authorship list. Whatever you're doing, make sure that your words and your actions and your descriptions all match. So it's one thing to say that people should meet authorship criteria. It's another thing to make sure that the process is actually accessible. Now, I recommend making scientific writing as clear as possible, regardless of whether you're using a participatory approach. And again, as a journal editor, I can't tell you how difficult it seems to be for scientists to write in a clear way. Please, whether or not you're using a participatory approach, have good, strong, clear organization to your papers. Use topic sentences, the active voice, short sentences. Don't put 10 clauses between your subject and your verb. Try to have your writing be clear. But just because writing is clear doesn't mean that it has to be accessible to everyone. Scientific articles are not meant to be written in plain language. Scientific articles are written for an often very narrow academic audience that is reading a particular journal in a particular scientific field. So what happens if the paper needs to be written in language that's not actually accessible to all community co-authors? Now, some community partners may not need any changes to the typical practices, great, but many might, be it due to educational attainment, command of the English language, or whatever language the journal is in, reading level, intellectual disability, executive function, technical jargon, whatever. It is possible to do that, but it takes attention. And I've, over my career, included community partners that didn't speak English, community partners who haven't finished high school, community partners with intellectual disability, community partners with all sorts of challenges that might make it so that they cannot read or write the particular article, but they truly have met authorship criteria. So, getting back to how can we then do that? As I said, anyone who meets criterion 1 has to be offered the opportunity to be included. But criterion 2 is where we actually really have to think about how do we do this right. Not everyone has to write the paper, and whether I'm using community partners or academic partners or anybody, I can tell you sometimes it's easier to just write a draft than to try to piece together pieces from all sorts of different authors. Your choice. Regardless, though, what you can do is, if somebody isn't necessarily writing parts of the work, is that they have to be able to revise it critically for important intellectual content. How you revise something critically for important intellectual content does not necessarily mean that you have to read and edit that particular draft. So, of course, create processes that match your individual project or team, but use things that allow people to get at the concepts, because that's what really matters. We've used over the years, we've used a variety of different things that have helped people truly meet authorship criteria. First, we usually have a group meeting to discuss paper plans, framing. We might talk about how we're dividing the work into different manuscripts, what's important to emphasize, what are the take-home points, what are the important political issues or nuances or implications. All of these things can be done before you ever even get to writing. And then after we have drafts, we often will share drafts in a variety of ways, depending on the team members and depending on the particular paper. Sometimes, if most of the paper is relatively accessible and most of the team members can understand the majority of the paper, I just share annotated drafts where we'll have the paper, but then I'll have little comment bubbles explaining technical terms or concepts or main points. So I might just put a little comment and say, oh, this paragraph's trying to say this, this, and this. Remember when we did this, or what this means is that, and they can read the paper, but also read the comment bubbles for additional explanations. Sometimes that's not enough. And, when I've had co-authors who didn't speak English, or co-authors with very significant intellectual disabilities or with low reading levels, what we've done is we've actually created translated drafts. What for us that's looked like is we make a table where we have one set column of the table have kind of the paragraphs in the actual academic language, and then next to it is a translated version in plain language, Spanish, whatever it is that co-authors may be able to read to understand what's the main point that we're discussing here. What are we trying to say? And then we have group or one-on-one meetings to go over to discuss potential revisions. And oftentimes my community partners have made really, really important comments or have noted important things that we needed to add in, or that we might want to emphasize or interpret a different way, that have really made critical contributions to the paper itself. So then next thing to think about is managing team authorship. Now, again, this isn't just for participatory research. This is really anything where you're doing group authorship, but communication is critical. It really helps to create or adopt authorship guidelines early. On our website, we have posted our Aspire authorship guidelines. There's plenty other examples out there. I'd suggest that you talk to your team relatively early on, not necessarily the first meeting, that's boring, but relatively early on about authorship guidelines, authorship expectations. And then for a larger project, you may want to plan out one or more possible papers from the project. Of course, knowing that plans change and they may or may not all get written. They may or may not all happen in that order, but it's good to kind of have a bigger picture of what we're getting out of the project. And then for each one, what we tend to do is we first decide on who's going to be the first author, and if applicable, a senior author or corresponding author. And we try to do that relatively early on, because a lot of the work is going to happen by the first author, with mentorship and guidance from a senior author. And then offer the opportunity to be a co-author to anyone meeting criteria number 1, meaning, again, they've been significantly involved in the conception or the conduct of the research. And we try to be really clear on the process and expectations. We try to kind of, again, know how we're going to be determining authorship order, but it's okay to finalize authorship order after most of the work is done, because sometimes it turns out that somebody actually steps up a lot more, or somebody may be taking a smaller role. That being said, the actual writing and revisions is only a part of the work. The work is also the work that happened all throughout the project. So you do have to keep in mind how much people had contributed throughout the project while, again, we were conceptualizing the study, designing it, creating materials, collecting data, interpreting data, and so forth. Last question is really what happens when there's really big teams of authors. Again, this doesn't have to be just a participatory research issue, but with participatory research, once you have enough co-investigators and consultants and mentors and research staff, and then you add in a whole bunch of community partners, you sometimes get to where you might have more than 10 or 12 authors on a paper, which often is too much for journals. I'd consider using a consortium statement. Consortium statements are great. You should decide amongst your team for any particular paper who's going to be a named author versus only listed in the consortium for that particular paper, with the understanding that named authors may need to do a little bit more work than people that are just listed in the consortium. But the nice thing is that everyone in the consortium gets credit for it as a co-author. You can list it in, it's searchable under your particular name in PubMed, even if you're just listed in the consortium. You can put it on your CV and so forth. So next is, okay, we've gotten this paper, we've submitted this paper, we've gotten it published. Now what? Dissemination products, dissemination of papers is really, really important, and it's something where community partners can actually get much better attention to your work sometimes than academics can do on their own. Please encourage dissemination. But don't assume that community partners know all the weirdness about scientific literature norms. You're going to need to actually be pretty clear and explain the need to embargo findings until the publication date. Similarly, you may want to talk about the need for citation or accidental self-plagiarism. We had a situation once where a very well-meaning community partner who had co-authored an article went and put entire paragraphs of it in one of her blog posts, word for word, with no attribution, because she was thinking of this as a co-owned thing when in fact it hadn't even been published yet, and that was obviously a problem. And then, if not publishing open access, people need to understand all the nuances of copyrights and paywalls and the difference between something being open access and being in a free period, how it's okay to maybe distribute single copies, but you can't necessarily post them online. What's the difference between the actual published version that's behind a paywall and a last author version that you might still own the rights to, how you can give reprints, and etc. Many academics don't even understand all this stuff, but certainly don't expect your community partners to. And then you may want to discuss with your community partners the timing of social media or other dissemination efforts post-publication. It can be very difficult if, for example, one person is posting on it on social media before the first author has even seen it sometimes, let alone seen that it's come out sometimes, let alone been able to post it. Similarly, we often try to wait until the paper's in a free period, so there isn't a lot of pushback about it being behind a paywall. And if you can afford to make an article open access, of course, do that. Last thing is that projects shouldn't end with just a academic publication. That really defeats the purpose and works against your whole kind of desire for impact. Encourage community partners to take the lead or at least collaborate with you on materials for community audiences. Those can be community briefs or policy briefs. We use those in Autism in Adulthood. And I just have to say, they are not lay abstracts. They're much more than lay abstracts. I spent a lot of time working with authors to try to make sure that the community briefs really stand on their own and are accessible and targeted to community audiences. You might create press releases. Your community partners or others in their networks or your networks may wish to write blog posts or newsletter articles, create educational materials or trainings. All these things make the impact of your work go much further. And embrace creativity. One of my favorite outcomes from a CDPR project I did with the African American community years ago. One of our community partners wrote this beautiful song based off of the themes from one of our qualitative studies, and I can attest that her singing that song to a room full, packed room of Black women who were there for the event meant so much more than if I'd done my little PowerPoint, sharing what the themes of our research were. So again, embrace creativity, encourage community partners to do things with the work, with, of course, understanding the nuances of embargoes and publication dates and trying to get the scientific peer-reviewed articles out in a way, trying to get them out so that these things don't in any way hurt their ability to publish. So again, thank you to the Full Aspire team and to AARP, and we'll be back for more videos.